Imagine a tropical paradise, right? But the local police are pinned down by civilian sniper fire from, like, 800 meters away.
Yeah, not your typical postcard image.
Exactly. And while this is happening, a government all the way in the Caucasus is actively stoking digital flames on TikTok. And the global supply chain for critical minerals is basically threatening to collapse the local economy overnight.
It's a lot happening at once.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are setting the scene in New Caledonia. It's this sun-drenched Pacific archipelago that functions as a highly critical but extremely volatile strategic asset for France.
Highly volatile is right.
Yeah. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack what is essentially a geopolitical stress test of the highest order. We're going to look at how a seemingly stable, meticulously crafted 30-year peace process just completely shattered.
Right into a literal armed insurrection in 2024.
Exactly. And then we're going to look at how the recently concluded June 2026 provincial elections are, forcing this incredibly gridlocked society to somehow chart a new path forward.
And to map out this collapse and the political fallout that came after, we are drawing from a very specific stack of sources today.
Yeah, we've got some great material.
We do. First, we have a deeply historical political analysis from the Australian National University, the ANU, which tracks the long-term institutional decay.
Crucial context.
Right. And we are pairing that with a really rigorous security and tactical briefing from the Institute Montaigne. That one breaks down the actual mechanics of the 2024 insurgency.
Which is wild, by the way.
It is. And finally, we are overlaying all of this with granular 2026 election data from The World Is Not Enough political blog, plus some really current on-the-ground reporting from the Anadolu Agency.
So you might be wondering why a political dispute on an island of, 270,000 people matters to you?
It sounds so far away.
Right. But if you care about how foreign powers use digital disinformation to, fuel local fires, or how global supply chains for critical minerals like nickel can just collapse overnight.
Or even just how aging democracies handle deeply fractured populations.
Yes. Then this deep dive is basically a masterclass in modern statecraft. Now, I do want to make a quick note. Because our sources cover some really intense politically charged conflicts, we're talking indigenous rights, anti-colonialism, national sovereignty.
Heavy topics.
Very heavy. So our goal today is to impartially report the data and the viewpoints from both the pro-independence and the loyalist camps exactly as the sources present them. We aren't taking any sides. We aren't endorsing any faction.
You're just here to map the terrain of the crisis.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. So to understand the violence of 2024, or even the math of the 2026 elections, we really have to look back at the peace deal that held this place together for decades.
Yeah, you really can't comprehend the explosive nature of what happened recently without dismantling that original architecture. The entire political ecosystem of New Caledonia is built on this profound bipolar schism.
Like a society just completely split in half.
Exactly. It's bisected by these competing visions of sovereignty. On one flank, you have the pro-independence movement, which is driven primarily by the indigenous Kanak population.
Right.
And then on the opposite flank, you have the non-independentist or the loyalist camp. And this demographic is really anchored by the Caledonia, which are populations of European descent with deep generational roots on the island.
Generations, yeah. And there are other groups in there too, right?
Yes, alongside other migrant communities, most prominently the Loyalists, who are non-indigenous Polynesians.
And the sources make it very clear that the schism wasn't just a political disagreement, it was forged in blood.
Unfortunately, yes.
The ANU analysis dedicates a lot of space to the 1980s. They euphemistically called it les événements, the events. But historians classify it straight up as a low-intensity civil war.
Yeah, the events is a very mild way to describe it.
Seriously, you had the FLNKS, which is the Kanak and Socialist National Liberation Front, basically mobilizing for full indigenous sovereignty. And pushing back against them was the RPCR, the Loyalist Coalition, determined to keep the French Republic in control.
And that violence in the 80s left deep, deep psychological scarring on the territory. I mean, the conflict escalated into guerrilla-style warfare, targeted assassinations.
Brutal stuff.
Absolutely. And the breaking point actually arrived with the 1988 Ouvéa cave massacre.
Oh, right, the hostage situation.
Yeah. Pro-independence militants took French gendarmes hostage in a limestone cave. And that led to a massive military assault ordered directly by Paris.
Which The sources say was the largest combat operation involving French citizens since the Algerian War, right?
Exactly. It resulted in the deaths of 19 Kanak militants and 6 French military personnel.
So that trauma, the sheer shock of Nouméa, is what finally forced both sides to the negotiating table. That led to the Matignon Accords in 1988 and eventually the real cornerstone of modern New Caledonia, the 1998 Nouméa Accord.
Which is such a fascinating document.
It is. The sources describe it not just as a peace treaty, but almost as a bespoke constitutional anomaly within the French Republic.
Yeah, it established this 20-year roadmap for decolonization based on a concept they called the ratchet mechanism.
The ratchet mechanism. Tell us how that actually worked.
It's probably one of the most unique pieces of constitutional engineering in the modern era. The French state legally bound itself to an irreversibly one-way transfer of power.
Unprecedented.
Completely. So once Paris handed a portfolio over to the local government in Nouméa, like, say, primary education or labor law or civil safety, they could never take it back.
Wow.
And the data shows that between 1998 and 2021, France transferred 35% of its sovereign powers outright, and they shared another 51%.
That is wild. It feels akin to, like, a corporate spin-off.
Right. What do you mean?
Like the parent company, France, transfers all this operational control, intellectual property, local revenue streams to a subsidiary, and signs a contract saying they'll never take them back.
That's actually a really good way to look at it.
It's like a roommate agreement where one roommate is slowly forced to hand over the keys, the bank accounts, and the chore list, but desperately wants to keep their name on the lease.
Right, because Paris only kept the big stuff. Defense, currency, foreign affairs. Just 8 core powers remained with them.
But the gamble seems to be that if Paris gives this subsidiary almost total autonomy, the subsidiary will eventually realize, hey, independence is redundant now. We'll just voluntarily stay in the parent's ecosystem.
And that was exactly the loyalist and state calculation. The idea was to de-escalate these existential blood and soil conflicts into, tedious technocratic debates about administrative budgets.
Make it boring so people stop fighting.
Exactly. And honestly, for 20 years it worked. The violence stopped. But the pro-independence Kanak leaders, they viewed the Nouméa Accord through a totally different lens.
Right, because for them, it wasn't the final destination.
No, administrative autonomy was just the vehicle. The end goal was always international recognition and the complete severing of the colonial tether. So, the Accord accommodated this by embedding 3 scheduled referendums on final independence.
And here's where I have to push back a bit based on what we're reading. If they transferred 86% of their sovereign powers, either fully or shared, why wasn't that enough to satisfy the push for independence?
Because for the independentists, sovereignty isn't a percentage. You can't be 86% sovereign. And the Nouméa Accord built in those 3 referendums as off-ramps.
But by scheduling them, the Accord basically planted a time bomb inside its own peace process, didn't it? Like they kicked the can down the road, but the road just abruptly ended in 2018.
That's exactly what happened. The first referendum in 2018 yielded a 56.7% no vote against independence.
So they voted to stay French.
Yes. And the Loyalists celebrated, but behind closed doors, that margin was a huge shock to the political establishment. Polling had suggested a blowout for the no camp. Yeah. Some predicted like 70%.
Wow, so 56.7 was way too close for comfort.
Way too close. It gave the FLNKS immense momentum. So by the time the second referendum arrived in 2020, the no vote eroded even further. It dropped to 53.3%.
That's razor thin.
The margins had tightened to fewer than 5,000 individual ballots. The pro-independence movement could mathematically see the finish line.
But then the 2021 referendum arrived, and the entire framework just collapsed under the weight of a pandemic.
Yeah, COVID really broke the system.
The independentists petitioned Paris to delay the vote. They argued that severe COVID lockdowns were restricting traditional Kanak mourning rights, which basically paralyzed their ability to campaign in indigenous communities.
Right. The mourning customs are deeply communal and involve travel, which was banned.
But Paris, facing its own domestic political pressures to finally resolve this New Caledonia question once and for all, refused to adjust the timeline.
And the FLNKS responded with a total boycott. They instructed their voters in a policy of non-participation. So the Loyalists essentially went to the polls alone.
Which led to a grotesque distortion of the electorate. The result was a 96.5% no victory, but with an abysmal 43.8% voter turnout.
Yeah, a hollow victory. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Nouméa Accord de-escalated existential threats into technocratic debates, but its built-in clock meant the territory eventually ran out of road to kick the can down.
And the consequences of that boycott were huge. It basically stripped the peace process of its legitimacy. Technically, Paris said the legal requirements were fulfilled, but politically, that 2021 vote resolved absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. The Loyalists declared the independence debate permanently closed, the independentists declared the referendum totally invalid, and the territory plunged right into a constitutional vacuum.
A very dangerous vacuum, because the hollow victory left this bitter taste, but it was actually a highly specific, highly technical piece of legislation introduced in early 2024 that acted as the accelerant.
Yes, to grasp the mechanics of the 2024 insurrection, we have to look at the concept of the frozen electoral roll.
This is wild to me.
It is. As a concession in the 1998 Nouméa Accord, local provincial elections operated under a restricted electorate. If you arrived in New Caledonia after 1998, you were legally barred from voting in those local assemblies.
Meaning a citizen could live in Nouméa for 2 decades, pay local taxes, build a business, literally vote for the president of France, but have absolutely no legal voice in their own provincial legislature.
Exactly. And the French government in 2024 viewed this as an untenable violation of universal suffrage. So they initiated a constitutional reform to unfreeze the roll, enfranchising anyone with 10 years of continuous residency.
Which seems reasonable on paper if you're looking at standard democratic norms. But the independentist bloc viewed this reform as an existential threat.
Because that frozen roll was originally designed to protect the demographic weight of the indigenous Kanak population.
Right. There is this deep historical fear among the Kanak people of being demographically swamped by organized migration from metropolitan France.
Which is a tactic historically employed in other colonial contexts. You dilute the indigenous voting blocks to prevent independence. Unfreezing the roll would immediately inject tens of thousands of predominantly loyalist voters into the local system.
So a hardline pro-independence faction known as the CCAT emerged. They framed this electoral reform as a permanent, deliberate strategy to kill any future chance of Kanak sovereignty. And here, the Institut Montaigne briefing gets incredibly detailed. It shows how this political dispute instantly mutated into something the state categorized not as a riot, but as a high-intensity internal armed conflict.
Yeah, the tactical shift in the 2024 uprising represents a terrifying evolution in civilian mobilization. This territory has a heavily entrenched hunting culture, which means it has an exceptionally militarized civilian population.
The numbers in the report are staggering.
The High Commissioner estimated 64,000 declared firearms among 270,000 residents, and with illegal arsenals, that number is likely pushing toward 100,000.
Wow, so the insurgents didn't just bring rocks to a barricade. They brought large-caliber, high-powered rifles.
Exactly. And the engagement metrics from the Montaigne report really highlight this. French security forces were taking sustained fire from distances up to 800 meters.
800 meters, that's a half-mile away. This is a profound shift from traditional urban public order disturbances. Usually riot engagement is, what, a few dozen meters?
Right. Usually you're dealing with thrown objects or maybe small arms at close range. But here, the insurgents were employing asymmetric sniper tactics. Gendarmerie armored columns reported taking over 350 confirmed direct hits from live ammunition.
350?
Yes. In the district of Saint Louis, a single armored vehicle absorbed 12 direct rifle rounds during just one extraction mission.
That is just intense. 2 gendarmes and 12 civilians or insurgents were killed in this conflict, right? With over 550 military personnel injured.
Which is exactly why the lethality of the intent forced a huge strategic calculus in Paris regarding how to counter it.
Why didn't they just send the regular French army?
Because deploying the army forces that are structured and trained for enemy neutralization under the law of armed conflict would have legally and politically escalated the crisis into a formalized civil war.
Ah, I see.
Instead, the state relied exclusively on the Gendarmerie Nationale. That's a military force, but its peacetime mandate is domestic law enforcement.
So that jurisdictional distinction governed their rules of engagement. The gendarmes were taking military-grade sniper fire, but had to operate under strict policing protocols.
Exactly. Their mandate was judicialization arresting suspects to face a magistrate, rather than neutralization like you'd have in a war zone.
But maintaining fire discipline while absorbing hundreds of rifle rounds, I mean, that requires immense deployment of specialized technology just to protect the personnel.
And the logistical response was massive. The state shipped 43 heavy armored vehicles to the island. Prominently, they featured the newly commissioned Centaur models.
The ones with the massive blades.
Yes. They're equipped with 3.5-ton hydraulic blades. And those were essential because the insurgents weren't just building barricades, they were fortifying them, booby-trapping them with industrial gas cylinders, and covering the approaches with enfilading fire.
Terrifying. So the Centaur allowed the forces to basically bulldoze those choke points without exposing their infantry.
Exactly. And they also deployed acoustic surveillance tech, specifically the Pillar V system.
Okay, explain how the Pillar V works, because the report's details on this blew my mind.
It's incredible tech. When a sniper fires from half a mile away in a dense urban or jungle environment, visual identification is nearly impossible. You just can't see them. But the Pillar V instantly calculates the acoustic origin of the supersonic crack and the muzzle blast.
So it listens to the bullet.
Right. And it gives the gendarmerie the real-time coordinates of the shooter.
That is why.
They paired this technology with operators from the GIGN, which is France's premier counterterrorism unit. They use it to execute targeted pre-dawn raids aimed at dismantling the CCAT command structure without initiating prolonged firefights.
That makes sense. Arrest the leaders before they can organize. But here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just a physical battlefield. There was an entirely invisible war happening at the exact same time.
Yes, the Montaigne analysis highlights how localized violence is now simultaneously fought in the global information space. Foreign adversaries were actively intervening in the New Caledonia crisis to strategically bleed France.
And the primary antagonist in this digital theater was Azerbaijan, which sounds absurd on the surface, doesn't it? A petrostate in the Caucasus concerning itself with the Pacific archipelago?
It sounds completely random until you look at the geopolitical linkage, which traces back to the Nagorno-Karabakh War. France provided very vocal diplomatic and military support to Armenia during that conflict.
So this was retaliation?
Exactly. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev initiated a strategy to destabilize French overseas territories in return.
How did they actually do it, though?
Well, Aliyev utilized the non-aligned movement to establish the Baku Initiative Group, or the JIB. And this wasn't merely some talking shop forum, it was a funded apparatus.
Right.
They invited pro-independence figures from Caledonia, Corsica, French Polynesia, and gave them international platforms to amplify narratives of French colonial oppression.
So they provided the geopolitical scaffolding to legitimize the uprising globally.
Right, but it went beyond diplomacy. Viginum, which is the French state agency tasked with monitoring foreign digital interference, uncovered an active tactical disinformation campaign running parallel to the barricades.
They dubbed it Unnotorious Big, right, after the Baku Initiative Group acronym.
Yes. Azerbaijani operatives were flooding platforms with fabricated and doctored content. Specifically, they were falsely accusing French security forces of executing Kanak civilians in areas like Saint Louis.
The objective clearly being to internationalize the crisis. They wanted to mutate a complex constitutional dispute over a voting roll into an alleged human rights atrocity.
Exactly, which of course accelerated the mobilization of youth on the ground who are seeing these fake posts.
And this convergence of physical violence and digital acceleration led the French government to execute a highly controversial tactical maneuver. They instituted a targeted territorial blackout of TikTok. They literally physically severed the platform's access within New Caledonia.
It was unprecedented for them.
Right. Now, imagine your own government shutting down a major social media app during a massive protest. The immediate reflex is to cry censorship, right? Was the censorship or a necessary tactical maneuver?
The Montaigne briefing argues strongly that this was not about suppressing political speech. It was a military necessity based on how the platform was functioning operationally. The security apparatus identified the social media ecosystem as the insurgency's operational center of gravity.
Okay, expand on that. Center of gravity, how?
The platform wasn't just facilitating communication between groups. It was engineering what analysts term narcissistic exposure. The algorithm was rewarding extreme acts of destruction with instantaneous viral visibility.
Ah, so the riots became an interactive, gamified spectacle.
Exactly. Unemployed, disconnected youth were being drawn to the barricades not by some deep ideological fervor regarding the frozen electoral roll, but by the gravitational pull of the broadcast. They wanted to be seen.
That makes total sense. So by blacking out TikTok, the state dismantled the reward mechanism. They broke the viral emulation effect and rapidly degraded the coordination of the violence.
Right, they contained the digital contagion.
But unfortunately, the physical destruction left behind an economic crater that basically threatens the viability of the entire territory. The Anadolu Agency reporting quantifies the material devastation at approximately 2 billion euros.
2 billion, it's staggering.
Which represents roughly a quarter of New Caledonia's annual GDP, vaporized in a matter of weeks.
And the secondary effects are even more crippling. We're looking at a mass exodus of 10,000 to 20,000 residents fleeing the instability. And they are taking critical capital, medical expertise, and administrative skills right out the door with them.
Brain drain, capital flight. And furthermore, the reconstruction mechanism is paralyzed because the insurance sector is just retreating.
Right. Insurers are looking at the unmitigated political risk and just refusing to issue policies.
You can't rebuild commercial infrastructure or secure supply chains in a zone where underwriters calculate the risk of recurrent arson as a near certainty. It just doesn't work.
And all of this localized destruction feeds directly into the larger structural collapse of the island's primary economic engine. The nickel industry.
Yeah, let's talk about the nickel. New Caledonia sits on some of the largest nickel reserves on the planet. It's an asset that historically accounted for, up to 20% of its GDP?
Between 15 and 20%, yes. But possessing the raw material is irrelevant if the global market structure renders your extraction methods obsolete.
Explain that. What changed in the global market?
The structural collapse is deeply tied to technological shifts. The traditional smelting operations in New Caledonia are incredibly energy-intensive. For years, the international mining conglomerate Glencore poured capital nearly $9 billion into the Koniambo Nickel SS or KNS plant located up in the northern province, just trying to make it profitable.
$9 billion is a massive sunk cost.
It is. But the global market was radically disrupted by Indonesia, which is heavily backed by Chinese investment. Indonesia scaled up a technology called HPAL, high-pressure acid leaching.
HPAL.
Yeah, and HPAL allows for the extraction of battery-grade nickel from lower-quality laterite ores far more efficiently and cheaply than traditional smelting. So Indonesia just flooded the global market with cheap nickel, driving prices way down.
So you have depressed global prices, exorbitant local energy costs, and then the sudden explosion of political instability in 2024. The calculus was simple for international capital.
Glencore just walked away. They abandoned the partnership. They placed the KNS plant into care and maintenance mode.
Meaning, they shut down production, but kept the furnaces warm to prevent structural damage.
Exactly, leaving thousands of jobs suspended in this void. And despite the French government trying to engineer a nickel pact to subsidize energy costs, the fundamental economics just remain toxic for Western investors.
This raises an important question regarding the broader Indo-Pacific chessboard, doesn't it? Because if the local economy enters a death spiral, the geopolitical vacuum becomes incredibly dangerous.
It's extremely dangerous. New Caledonia generates a staggering 1.3 million square kilometer exclusive economic zone, an EEZ for France.
Massive maritime domain.
It is. It's crucial for France's power projection. It provides basing for its navy and anchors its strategic presence against an increasingly assertive China in the region.
So the strategic anxiety in Paris must be palpable. I mean, if the territory achieves independence or simply collapses into bankruptcy, it will urgently require a new sovereign patron just to fund its administration and buy its stranded nickel assets.
And Beijing has a very well-documented strategy of leveraging infrastructure loans and resource extraction to secure footholds in the Pacific,
which France is preemptively attempting to harden against. The 2024 to 2030 military programming law actually injects 13 billion euros into French overseas territories. They're actively doubling the military reservist footprint in New Caledonia and delivering new advanced patrol vessels to secure that EZ.
Right. They're trying to build a fortress around a collapsing economy.
But military hardware cannot solve a political deadlock. The Nouméa Accord is dead. The economic engine is stalled. The streets are cleared, but deeply fractured.
Which brings us to the pivotal June 2026 provincial elections. The voters went back to the polls to elect the local assemblies that must now somehow negotiate the ultimate final status of New Caledonia.
Let's break down the math from those elections. Based on the world is not enough data. It really reveals a society paralyzed by its own geography. When voting behavior is rigidly determined by ethnic and historical identity, the electorate barely shifts.
Yeah, it's very entrenched.
So the anti-independence loyalist bloc won 47.9% of the total vote, heavily concentrated in the affluent, urbanized South province. And the pro-independence FLNKS bloc secured 41.5% of the total vote, dominating the rural North and the Loyalty Islands.
But the crisis actually lies within the architecture of the Territorial Congress, which is a 54-seat legislature.
Right. Because 47 is bigger than 41, so you'd think the Loyalists would control the Congress.
You would think so, but the electoral map was intentionally designed with malapportionment. During the 1998 negotiations, a structural concession was made to overrepresent the smaller pro-independence provinces.
Okay, why would they do that?
The logic was to ensure the Kanak population had a powerful legislative voice to prevent being permanently marginalized by the densely populated Loyalist South.
But the unintended consequence of that malapportionment in 2026 is absolute gridlock. Despite the Loyalists winning a larger share of the raw popular vote, the translation into seats gives the pro-independence bloc 26 seats, while the Loyalists hold 24.
Exactly. Neither faction reaches the 28 seats required to form a governing absolute majority.
So nobody's in charge.
Nobody. And to understand how they might navigate this impasse, the ANU research directs us to examine the shifting tectonic plates within the two main coalitions. Because the moderate voices that engineer the 30-year peace are basically being sidelined.
Yeah, let's look at the Loyalists first. Power has consolidated under Lev Republicans Caledonians, led by Sonia Bacchus. The trauma of the 2024 insurrection has really hardened their platform into uncompromising rejection of further concessions, hasn't it?
It has. Bacchus's faction is demanding the immediate reversal of the frozen electoral roll, permanently expanding the electorate. And crucially, they are targeting what's called the rebalancing policy.
The rebalancing policy.
Yeah, this is a financial mechanism dating back to the Nouméa Accords. It was designed to correct historical economic disparities by heavily taxing the prosperous, loyalist-controlled South to fund infrastructure and development in the Kanak-controlled North and Islands.
But the Loyalists are arguing that after 3 decades, the rebalancing policy has failed to generate a sustainable economy in the North. They see it now as a mechanism that punitively drains the South to subsidize their political opponents.
Right. They want the wealth redistribution halted, and their ultimate objective is to anchor New Caledonia unconditionally within the French Republic.
Okay, so that's the hardened Loyalist stance, but the independentist FLNKS coalition is experiencing its own internal fracturing, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. The moderate wing, represented by the Palika Party, actually recognizes the economic devastation and is cautiously advocating for a model termed independence in partnership with France.
Unassociated states.
Exactly. This would legally transform New Caledonia into an associated state. It grants international sovereignty and self-determination to the Kanak people, which fulfills the ideological goal of decolonization.
But practically it outsources defense, currency management, and massive financial subsidies right back to Paris.
Yes, it's a pragmatic compromise.
However, the hardline faction of the FLNKS, led by the Union Caledonian and Daniel Goa, officially demands a total, unmitigated rupture from France.
But, and this is a fascinating paradox uncovered by the ANU analysis, privately, even the hardliners understand that an isolated Kanak state would face instantaneous economic ruin.
They know they can't survive alone.
They recognize a $1.7 billion structural funding gap and the predatory realities of the Indo-Pacific. They know they need French capital and security. But the political rhetoric required to maintain their base prevents them from openly negotiating a compromise.
It's just systemic paralysis, which elevates the importance of those remaining 4 seats in the 54-seat Congress, the kingmakers.
Right, the balance of power is held by the third-way moderates.
The Oceanic Awakening Party, representing the Wallisian community, secured 4 seats. And a nascent civil society coalition named Fair Pays, which translates to making a country, captured nearly 4% of the vote.
The Wallisian dynamic is particularly compelling here. As a migrant community that historically aligned with the Loyalists for economic security, they often found themselves caught in the crossfire of the Kanak-Caldoche conflict.
So their emergence as an independent political force alongside Fair Pays mirrors something like the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland.
That's a great comparison.
Their demographics exhausted by the binary, zero-sum nature of ethno-nationalist conflict. They are creating a structural bridge right in the middle of the war zone. They just want the restoration of supply chains, the stabilization of the nickel industry, and physical security over ideological maximalism.
And the data supports the existence of this exhausted center. The ANU highlights polling models and Vox Pop interviews from 2021, indicating a silent majority across both the Kanak and Loyalist communities. Their primary concerns are actually economic survival and peace, rather than rigid constitutional victories.
So what does this all mean for the listener today? It means the political factions in Nouméa are facing a brutal, looming deadline. The Congress cannot govern without a coalition, and the territory cannot rebuild without a finalized political status that reassures international capital.
They must forge a new grand bargain.
The choice is stark. Succumb to an endless cycle of asymmetric violence and economic degradation, or embrace a deeply uncomfortable compromise like the associated state model, where maximalist dreams are sacrificed so the population can actually survive.
It is a profound test of democratic resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Can a polarized society accept a shared, flawed reality, or will they allow the territory to consume itself in pursuit of absolute sovereignty?
It's a huge question, but before we conclude this deep dive, there is one final piece of demographic data from the ANU research that basically entirely reframes the political map we've just discussed.
The geographic shifts.
Yes. For an hour, we have analyzed this conflict through geographic and ethnic lines. The Kanak pro-independence voters isolated in the rural north, and the European loyalists concentrated in the urban south. But quietly, beneath the surface of the barricades and the deadlocked Congress, the human geography has fundamentally changed.
The structural realities of migration and urbanization are basically outpacing the political narratives.
Today, a surprising 52% of the Kanak population now lives in the urbanized, loyalist-controlled South. That is up from just 39% in 1989.
That is a massive demographic shift.
It changes everything. While politicians fight over historical lines drawn in the sand, the actual citizens of New Caledonia are moving, integrating, and living side by side in the exact same neighborhoods across Greater Nouméa.
Which suggests a really compelling reality. When the political maps no longer reflect the human geography, the society is forced to evolve beyond its historical divisions.
Perhaps the ultimate solution to the island's future won't be found in a treaty signed in Paris, but in the unavoidable reality of just having to live side by side in those neighborhoods. It's definitely something to think about.
Truly.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the surface narratives of the global news you hear, and we will catch you next time.